Good afternoon, good morning, good late afternoon or evening to everybody who's joining here today. Thank you so much for joining us. We are trying to be a bit more meaningful about how we think about designing the capacity development or the capacity strengthening webinars that we have to focus it a little bit more on where are you at and how we can support you with giving you some resources or strategies or insights on how to help you manage or navigate the different steps in terms of implementing the work that you need to do. And so it's from that framework or that perspective that this webinar has been designed, is really thinking through. We are now at a space where some of us in our group have developed our ethics applications. Some of us are busy doing that. Some of us are still finalizing how we are going to be doing our methodologies in order for us to develop the ethics application. And some of us have received approval and we are busy collecting information. And so what I have done here is to think about the participatory research project cycle. And so some of the content you might go, I'm not sure if this is for me. I've already passed this, but some of it, some of us are at different stages, and some of it you might go, okay, I'm still going to get there. And so I just wanted to give you some insights on and some ways of thinking about these different pieces of the work that you will be doing. I want to also just remind us why this kind of seminar is important and why we're doing this more applied type of seminar. A key component for you good is to understand how these different approaches help us to move the agenda forward for young people in the global south, right? So we have these two research questions that are framed around this. That's part of our agenda, which we, as you know, frame within the relational gathering perspective. And so when we are focusing on this, it's really to also help you think about what type of information or learnings would be valuable for you to document when you're doing your reporting at the end of the year. I say this because, as you know, when we did our initial training last year, many of us were thinking, what kind of information are you looking for? And so now when we're doing our next session, we're obviously going to be asking a little bit more content and experiential and reflections information. And so this is why it's important. It's because we want to understand what are those approaches that's going to help us to study and to advance youth well-being in the global south. We want to understand what type of approaches, of which methodological approaches promote meaningful and active participation amongst young people. So I just wanted to frame this, that this is an important component of the work that we are doing. Now, the other hat that I wear besides my HSRC researcher hat is I teach a course, a master's course in a research ethics discipline. And so I framed this work really around the ethics of doing research. And so the first part that I'll speak through is about the ethics in methodology. And when we talk about participatory research, as Angelique explained, Charlene has previously in the emancipatory seminar with other colleagues really outlined for us these different research methodologies on a continuum around participation, which she spoke about interactive methodologies, participatory methodologies, emancipatory methodologies, and what that means. And we all know participatory methodologies. I say we all know. I feel like I can confidently say that because all of you are employing participatory methodologies in terms of your designs. But the ethics around that is about encouraging participation in research. And so I want to speak about that a little bit, and there I'll talk about the project cycle. And then we'll go into ethics as we all understand it in terms of participant protection and so forth. So those are the two pieces that I'll be touching on today. So let's talk about ethics in methodology. So ethics, very quickly, not a seminar on ethics really, but it's really about the guidelines or the rules or the govern how we do what we do and why we do it in a very particular way. So sometimes ethics can be evaluative, where we're saying this is right and this is wrong, and often that's the perspective that's taken in when we do ethics in research around participant protection. But when we think about it from a methodological perspective, we think about ethics as in an approach that we employ that could be appropriate or inappropriate for who we're working with. So I always think about methodologies not as right or wrong, but as appropriate and inappropriate based on who I'm working with, what the topic is, where the work is being conducted, and a range of other questions. And so when we think about ethics in that way from a methodological perspective, when we talk about participatory research, it becomes even more critical for us to ensure that the approaches we are using is really facilitating that meaningful and active participation, which is the principles on which participatory research is premised. So let's now go into a bit more detail on the participatory research cycle. Now, for those who are more seasoned researchers, and for those who are upcoming developing scholars, you might be fairly familiar with the research cycle, right? So we know we're designing research, we are implementing research, we're analyzing, we're interpreting, and so forth. What stands out from the participatory research cycle, though, is that there's two elements that are important here, which is, just trying to see if my cursor will show. This one, establishing and facilitating partnership, and then the way we are enacting these other two around analyzing and interpreting, and then disseminating and acting. So very briefly, just on what all of this means, I think we all are fairly clear and probably more confident in the design component around participatory research, how we designed our work. Everybody was able to pitch what they are doing, what methodologies they are using, who they're going to be collecting with, and all of those things. So designing the research, I think we all do fairly well in that. Then another part, the next part that we want to talk about in the cycle is once we know what we are doing, we need to figure out who we are wanting to work with. Now, this is a long-term investment. It's about thinking through who are those individuals that need to be involved, consulted, engaged in the work that you are doing, including the people that are the gatekeepers. And so for us, many of us are doing, or we are all doing quite diverse work. We've got linkages in terms of themes, linkages in terms of age, and so forth. But the focus of the work is diverse within the group. So if, for example, we are doing, one of the projects are doing work around intergenerational relationships, it might not just only be the individual, the young person you're talking to that you might want involved in the work that you're doing. It might be those other people that are also going to be impacted by the results that you are potentially going to find. So really thinking through who these partners in who these young people and the partners that are related to the work is going to be very beneficial for the other stages of the project cycle that you'll be engaged with. And it's about thinking here through what those strategies are that you're going to facilitate, that you're going to implement to facilitate ongoing partnerships. So what I have seen and I've experienced as and am guilty of in some other studies is, we start building partnerships and relationship in the start of the project, and then we touch base again sometime towards the end to just share the findings. And the question that I pose to you and to us as a team in the work that we are doing is that participatory or is that consultative? And so I'm throwing that out there because, like I said, some of us are busy building these partnerships. Some of us are in the partnerships. But it's really thinking meaningfully about what does that mean to have this long-term investment, long-term as in as long as the project is, and post, hopefully, around facilitating this. And in thinking about that, thinking about how do you balance what I like to refer to as lived experience expertise, so the young people that you are consulting, versus research expertise in creating these partnerships. I'm going to go into a bit more detail on this and offer some guidelines or some options that you might use. I'm just talking through it for now. I think where we do well also is gathering information. I think we all have ways and methodologies and approaches that we've identified that will help us to gather the information in a participatory way. So there's two ways that I think about this, and I think our projects are split in this way. There are projects that are that are using methodologies that will facilitate active engagement through data collection. So the methodology in itself is about active participation. So let's think about photo voice or um, expression sessions or diary exercise, journaling. Those are active participation, right? But some of us are also doing participatory approaches that's towards developing something that it will not be participatory. So, for example, our tools might be a survey tool that is not necessarily a participatory tool, so I'm not doing anything, I'm filling in a survey, but the approaches that I've implemented prior to that is participatory. So there are different ways in which we can think about the methodologies that we employ to facilitate participation, and this will look different for different projects. And I say this because when we go into discussions, I don't want anyone to feel like you're not doing this or you're doing that, but that different people are employing this in different ways. And of course, we've already evaluated the work that you are doing and we do consider it participatory. This is some guidelines to help you to strengthen some of the things that you're doing. So design we do well, establishing and facilitating partnerships. I think most of us have at least described what that might be. Some of us have not unpacked who that exactly might be. And then our tools, I think we've described that quite well as the group and what that might be. Where I think some not just us here, but in general, where we kind of lose track a little bit is around analyzing and interpreting. Some of us in the team has done really well in describing what those approaches would be for interpreting, and I find that very encouraging around thinking about how do we work with young people to interpret the work that we are doing and analyze the work that we are doing. And then lastly, disseminating and acting is the other component that stands out for the participatory research cycle. Is the acting part. So participatory research is often about change. It's about facilitating some type of change or producing action towards change. And so here it's thinking through what those strategies will be to disseminate the work and implementing activities that would or could potentially not now, but later facilitate the type of change that you are hoping to see in the work that you are doing. So let's look at each of these steps in a bit more detail. And again, the intention for these slides now is to provide you with some options that might help you think through these different pieces and encourage you to look at them in a bit more detail for how you might do this. I don't think we need to talk too much on project design because your designs and all of that has been established, but these are a few designs that we are using within YouGood, but also some other designs, but these are all around participatory research. Action science, you have citizen science. I've used citizen science previously to co-develop a South African policy, which is essentially inviting citizens from the community to engage with you in research. But I think I'm not going to stress too much on the project design. I think we do well in there. So what are some options for establishing and facilitating partnerships? I think it's about thinking through who the live experiences experts are that will help you frame and have impact in the work that you are doing. I often think about this when I think about young people, I often think about there's very little, and I say this with sensitivity to it, there's often very little that can happen outside of parents' knowledge of what we are doing, especially in the mental health space. So I think of not only the young person that I'm working with in terms of engaging and building partnerships, but other people that are directly affected or indirectly affected or beneficiaries of the work that we are doing. So when we talk about lived experience experts, we talk about persons that have current or previous experience in what we are looking at. We talk about people who are affected, closely affected, so caregivers, relevant, relatives, significant others. And we talk about those who are offering support, so working very closely with the persons that we are working with. And those are really the people that will provide, and I mean, you might have a range of different people, but these cohorts are important for us to think about impact of the work that we are doing and how we facilitate that through the partnerships that we are building. What are some ways in which we can do that? Advisory boards. I've shared a paper on advisory boards and and how useful these have been for us in doing work and designing a mixed method study on homelessness in South Africa. And so advisory boards are well known, and I think many of you have already indicated that you will be using advisory boards in the work that you are doing. But making sure that these advisory boards are not random, but they are informed. Again, who needs to be part of these? You will see our advisory boards in the paper that I shared were a collection of people, researchers, people with experience, people who offer support, different kind of categories of individuals.
Allô, ça va?
Hi. And so really thinking about who should that be that you're going to walk this long walk with. Obviously, there's co-researchers that you could establish through the work that you are doing, which might be part of your advisory board. It might be external to your advisory board, but that's another mechanism that you could use to facilitate partnerships in the work that you are doing. Now, there are some methodologies that might be useful to think about here, depending on what you are doing. When I looked at all of our um, um, projects, I think 20 out of the 23 is actually doing work with an intervention component. So either you are building an intervention or developing an intervention, you're evaluating an intervention, but you're trying to build one through the empirical work that you are doing. So a lot of us are doing that. And so there are different, even intervention focus like participatory evaluation that one could use as part of the work that we are doing in building partnerships and thinking through what that would mean. But yeah, again, many of you have already thought about this through participatory planning workshops or mapping exercises that you might be doing, and then, participatory evaluation. But these methodologies have been found useful to facilitate that partnership and engagement in the work that we're doing. Patient research networks or practice research networks is another way for us, for those who are working with young people with particular experiences, particularly around mental health, for example, might find this useful to bring in and create networks of stakeholders that would help unpack the work that we are doing and think about the implications in a bit more of a meaningful way. And then lastly, what would be useful for facilitating partnerships is these consensus building workshops. Some of you are doing this, but these are really about bringing ideas, what could be outcomes of a project at the end, depending on when you're using it, but bringing this to the group that you're going to work with and trying to co-identify where those avenues are for intervention or where those avenues are for further research or what you want to unpack, what you want to prioritize. Consensus building workshops are also great for theory of change activities. But those are some ideas on how you could facilitate this. Gathering information, again, I think we do well, as I said earlier here. And I also don't want to stress too much on this because I think we do well here. I think the only thing that I want to think about here is with some thoughts here is to think meaningfully about how the methodologies that we are using is impacted or should be shaped by who we are talking about in terms of age. Of course, we think about young people on a continuum, and so there's younger cohorts that we might be working with, and older cohorts what we might be working with, and often we do well to kind of separate that thinking. But that there are different methodologies. What we are using here, we've got storytelling, photo voice, workshops, mapping. There's a range of things that we are engaging with as you could in the team. And And then also, again, thinking about measures or the development of tools and interventions through participatory workshops. Discrete choice experiments is another really great opportunity to think about developing interventions. And I know one of my mental health colleagues is building on that. So lastly, moving lastly into analyzing and interpreting, and I wanted to just pause quickly here about just thinking there's a lot of pushback around how we use participatory research, and co-creation has become this buzzword. And I know there's something we engage with quite meaningfully in the application stages of around how people are wanting to facilitate co-creation in the work that they're doing. And so really thinking about that participation, people participating in the work doesn't always translate into co-creation. And so thinking about what are those methodologies that really is about collaboration and not just having people participate. So, because participation can mean giving your input, and that doesn't mean that it means that you are co-creating something with someone. So analysis is really about thinking, how do we involve young people in the work that we are doing? Now, many of us are involving young people as scholars. So we have youth that are going to be doing the analysis and interpreting and so forth. But those are not necessarily the young people that we are going to be involving in collecting information. So is there other ways that one could do kind of co-creation credibility checks with in as part of the program with the young people that are actually participating in the research? So just something to think about around how do we interpret collaboratively, participate in a participatory way with young people to they are going through or the findings that we are creating. Some ways of doing that, you might have heard of some of these methodologies. Citizen juries is one way to do that. You bring people together and you engage on those kind of outcomes with your participants. Again, participatory workshops or consensus building activities is another way. But there's also, I love to say this, develop something with young people around how can we come together once we have the findings to actually develop strategies to engage with what it is that we have developed. And I will share a resource on this that I found quite useful that helps think through what some of those mechanisms could be. And then on disseminating and acting, this is, like I said earlier, another part that is important for us as participatory researchers, is thinking about how do we make the work that we have, the results, the outcomes, available to different audiences. Thinking about the young people themselves, thinking about the other beneficiaries, the partners, the stakeholders that might be of the relevance here. I think here through a lens of research practitioners and policymakers, who would that be that we need to disseminate the work with? An activity would be stakeholder mapping, might be a nice activity to think through who those stakeholders are that are, involved and should be involved in the research and should know about the research and should do something about the research. And so a stakeholder activity would be useful. And thinking with the group around what would be some best practices for the group in terms of who we need to work with. Again, co-creating outputs and recognizing that an output for a policymaker or an output for a researcher is going to look very different to an output you generate for young people. And so if you want to have that impact in terms of generating knowledge with young people, you might want to think about what that's going to look like and how that translates on paper, look and feel in what we are creating. And then lastly, with acting, it's really about thinking, what are those activities that is going to facilitate change through the work that you are doing? And I think we definitely not only get stuck here because of how we do research, but research often stops before that because of how research institutions, I think, is often established. So we do research and policymakers do policy and practitioners do practice work. But in participatory work, we have an agenda to facilitate that change with these different stakeholders. So how do we do that without obviously overcommitting, but thinking about what would change look like in the work that we are doing? So again, some examples here would be roundtable discussions, participatory workshops, and mapping, and then youth advocacy partnerships is another approach that would be quite useful here to think through who must be the people, and where should the spaces be where change must occur. We know that not we can't always establish everything. Like everything is not something that we can prioritize, but we are those key activities that must change, and who are the actors that we need to engage with in order to facilitate that change. So that's the project cycle and the different kind of just considerations to think about as you are, again, you might be at different stages of this project cycle as you are engaging with the work that you are doing. I want to just quickly go through ethics in research, and I think this is a lot of questions we get around ethics. From the start of this program, people were asking about how do we do this type of research and what are some of the things to think about. And many of you might be at the stage where you are developing your ethics application. So the previous section was about those practical things about how do you operationalize the work in the different spaces. So this is a little bit more around actual ethics in terms of research. So, of course, this is the strategies that we put into place to make sure that participants are protected. Many of us, we come from different spaces, and so we are led by those institutional, first institutional, but also national, international kind of guidelines and commitments around how we operationalize the ethics that we are doing. Ethics is very much dependent on the approaches we're using. So the different methodologies, whether we're doing quantitative or qualitative work, requires different types of ethical considerations. Whether we're doing participatory research or traditional research, again, very different considerations for us to think about. The time frame of a study, again, whether if you're doing cross-sectional work and collecting information at one time point versus doing research as multiple follow-up, what kind of ethical considerations, especially if you're using different methodologies, whether you need repeated ethics, something to think about. And then the age, consent versus assent, ability of the participants and so forth, which I'll speak through quickly. We all know about informed consent and assent. I hope we're all fairly familiar with what this means. But just very briefly, because many of us are doing visual methodologies, and obviously participatory methodologies, but visual methodologies, these are the three kind of consenting processes in my experience and my very interactive engagement with our ethics committee in doing this work, is containing approval from caregivers, of course, if we're working with minors. When we obtain approval from caregivers, we need to think about, we need approval to engage them. So before we can engage, we need approval for that. We need approval to recruit them. And then we need approval to allow them to participate. So approval from caregivers need to be the first kind of point of engagement prior to engaging with young people. I know we all know this. I'm just making the point because sometimes that's where people get stuck with the recruitment start. We need approval from parents so that they can also know how the information will be used. Now, I state this because many times people get stuck here, and when they want to write their projects up, they actually never indicated that they are going to use the data for publication purposes or X purposes. And many journals now ask you whether you've received approval for that. So please make sure in your consenting and your assenting forms that you have this and you explain how you're going to use the information. From minors, not going to go into a lot of detail here. I think we know this, but non-coerced, the thing that I wanted to zone in here was non-incentivized recruitment, meaning not saying, I've got a 20 Rand, would you like to participate? But we do need to reimburse people for their time. So I'm not saying that research participants should not be reimbursed. I'm saying that when we, and not I, but many ethics committees are of the opinion that when we're recruiting young people, particularly, but people in general, that we should not stipulate that they will be paid for their time as a way to incentivize participation. And then thirdly, especially for visual data, is getting secondary consent for visual data. So participants often might take pictures of places and spaces and people. And if some of you are doing that kind of work, I'm happy to engage with you. I've got a form that we've developed that helps with the secondary consenting, including the processes of what that might look like. But just ensuring that you have that, and so that if there's a great picture that indicates something that you might not use later on because you don't have consent, you don't kind of lose that information there. Then some other considerations in practice now. So thinking about how we operationalize our work is confidentiality, of course, about ensuring that we make the identifiable information of the participations private. And one way, of course, we do that is through anonymity. And this is where the consenting for visuals become very important. Because obviously people need to know how the information is going to be used, especially if, they're secondary to the research. And really thinking about what is this going to mean in your work that you are doing, even if it's people drawing someone else. And if you're physically doing this work, how do you manage that if you are present? And one way is to say, we don't want to see the faces and the places of people, and so people could turn with their backs or anything like that. But I'm happy to share some content on how we've managed that in the past. And then safeguarding and referrals, I think the key thing I want to say here is making sure that we think through what those direct and indirect emotional, social, and relational consequences might be in participating. We are all doing somewhat heavy work, especially I think within the mental health space, but in general in the yoga studies about well-being. And we can't talk about well-being without thinking about what it means to not have well-being or to not live a well life. So just really thinking meaningfully about this. And this, again, all of these are coming from feedback that I've received from the ethics committee going, what about this? What about that? And thinking about the language when we're working with young people, that your consent forms really speak to the age group that you are talking to, so that they can understand what it is that you are expecting from them. And then here, just the last thing here is about making sure that those pathways for referral, when people are experiencing some kind of distress, is accessible. So whether this is virtual or in person, but that it's spaces that young people themselves can access, and if they can access without, as far possible, parental guidance, because they might be speaking about something that's impacting them within the home. Some of us are talking about those kind of issues in our work. And then just some guidelines that you could use that would inform. I know we're all working from different spaces, different countries, different contexts. So we will abide by those guidelines based on our institutions. Some of you have asked us for some guidelines on youth involvement, but some other guidelines that's focused on young people. The World Health Organizations have got quite a few guidelines on how to work with young people, involving young people in a participatory way. It can sometimes be a bit thematic, depending on what you're working on, but that might be useful to consider. The National Child Participation Framework is another really great framework that outlines what that might look like for you. And so there's some tips on there. And then, of course, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and other kind of human rights perspectives might help you think about the safety and protection of young people as you are doing the work that you would.